9 days ago on a Friday, I took the liberty of goofing off for just a few hours. I was driving my pickup down the road and I heard a variation on the "why did the chicken cross the road" joke. And I decided, you know what? I can do better than that. So I set about the task of coming up with new comedy material, inventing several new variations on the "why did the chicken cross the road" joke. And much to the chagrin of my Facebook audience, I shared all of them. How many of you had the pleasure of reading them? Okay, you get to hear some repeat material. The first one that popped in my head was, why did the playground equipment salesperson cross the road? To get to the other slide. And I followed that up with, why did the duck cross the road? Because it wasn't chicken. My wife's favorite, why did the Protestant cross the road? Because he didn't know how to cross himself. You know. You'll love this during election season. Why did Donald Trump cross the road? To part his hair on the other side. Now, trying to be fair, I tried to come up with something about Hillary, but I couldn't do it the other day, but now I have one. Why did Hillary cross the road? She didn't have to, she just sent an email. What, too soon? And after that, I got a little too big for my britches, and I came up with one that very few people got. Why did the chicken cross the road? Because it had yet to be introduced to the poetry of Robert Frost. And I don't mean to be condescending, but I'm referring to his poem, "The Road Not Taken." And after my next offering, I realized that my creative juices had finally run dry. Why did the vacationer cross the road? GPS. Then I knew I was done, right? But then I saw Dwayne, and we were talking about it, and I promised him that I would come up with something for him. And here it is. Why did Dwayne Bollinger cross the road? Because he can. So that same evening, and get this, this is how God works. The same evening, I was sitting in my screened-in back porch, and I decided I would take a look at the gospel reading for the next Sunday. This is 9 days ago, for this Sunday, today, which is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the parable is about someone who is willing to cross the road to care for someone who had been robbed and beaten half to death. And it took me about 2 seconds to realize that my sermon title today would be, "Why did the Samaritan cross the road?" Now I know there's a debate on whether or not they actually crossed the road or he stayed on that side of the road. We're just going to take the one version, the theory that says the Samaritan crossed the road to come and help. Now, before I answer the why question, let me first talk about this Samaritan in Jesus' parable. Notice that Jesus never calls the Samaritan good. That's what we've done. But Jesus didn't have to, because his goodness is implied in the story. And the second reason Jesus never calls him the Good Samaritan is because that would have been considered an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, because no Samaritans were good from the perspective of Jesus' listeners, including the lawyer that had started this whole dialogue, conversation with Jesus. To refer to the Samaritan as good would have created a reaction, at best, of rolled eyes and a dismissive smile, and at worst, the lawyer would have spat on the ground, cursed, and walked away. So a good storyteller, as Jesus was, would not want to sabotage his story by turning off the listener at such a crucial, critical point. So Jesus would never say a good Samaritan. According to first century standards, Samaritans were ethnically and religiously below par. They had Jewish ancestry, but they may have commingled with some non-Jewish people going back to the time of the Babylonian exile over 500 years earlier, when the best and the brightest of the Jews at that time were carried off into exile into Babylon. And the Samaritans were those who stayed behind. Many of them were. The irony is this. The word Samaritan means guardian of the law, or Torah. That's what the name means. So the Samaritans saw themselves as religious purists, in that they believed they were keeping the original intent of Judaism intact, that they were keeping the law. They were guarding the law, or the Torah. But to their neighbors to the north in Galilee and to the south in Judea, the Samaritans, right in the middle, were ethnically and religiously impure, and therefore they were looked at with contempt. And because of that, their morality was suspect as well. They could not do anything good. When I first started writing this sermon and thinking about it, days ago, I wanted to compare them to a specific ethnic and cultural group today called the Romani, which sometimes we use the word gypsies. Now, for a long time, the reason they're called gypsies is because people thought they came from Egypt. So gypsy and Egypt, you can see the connection between those words. But the consensus now is that the Romani originally descended from India about 1,000 years ago, and now they live all over the world in different places, speaking different languages and living in different cultures. They are pejoratively called gypsies, which has a connotation of being illegal and irregular. In fact, the label gypsy is where we get our word gyp, which means to cheat or swindle. So I suspect that while Jesus is telling the lawyer a story about a Samaritan who is willing to cross the road to help a man that not even a priest or a Levite was willing to help, it would have sounded to him much like it would sound to us today, or to many people today, if someone told us a story about a gypsy crossing a dangerous road to help someone rather than rob someone who is lying there half dead. Today, some listeners might roll their eyes as well, unfairly so, but they would. Now, but after what has occurred in our country this past week, and really going back for a while now, I think now I want to say something a little more generic and not as specific in terms of who this Samaritan might be today. And I came up with this. The Samaritan is symbolic of the other in our midst, the other. And the other is always defined by who we are. So if we are white, the other might be a person of color, and vice versa. If we are male, then the other might be female, and vice versa. If we are straight, the other is gay, and vice versa. If we are African American today, the other might be a police officer, and vice versa in some cases. If we are Christian, the other is the Muslim, and vice versa. And just like if we were Jewish in the first century, the other was a Samaritan, or more generally speaking, a Gentile, and vice versa. So reading this parable of the Good Samaritan is just as relevant today as it was then, because the others just don't seem to want to go away. And the one thing that can rock anyone's world is the notion that the other might be and can be morally superior to us, no matter who us is. So crossing the road is a metaphor for engaging the other when the other is bleeding to death. And I mean that either literally or metaphorically. When the car stopped and went to Dwayne in the ditch, they were crossing a barrier there, and they were helping Dwayne, who could have been bleeding to death if he had fallen over and hurt himself. Crossing the road is also a metaphor for recognizing the good in the other, You cross that mental barrier, and you begin to see the good in the other. So we are called as Christians to cross the road to be with the other, no matter how dangerous we might think that is. So I came up with a new phrase for this calling we have of crossing the road. I call it jaywalking for Jesus. You're free to use that if you'd like. So why is the road dangerous? I mentioned it was dangerous. Well, the parable mentions the road as being from Jerusalem to Jericho. This road, if you've been there, you know this, follows a wadi, which is a deep ravine. In this case, it is the Wadi Kelt. That's the name of it. It's a very dangerous place. It's a deep ravine. So crossing a wadi to get to the other side of the road is dangerous because there's wild animals and maybe even bandits that could attack you at any time, which is maybe one reason why the priest and the Levite were not willing to cross the road, because they were afraid they'd end up like the man who was lying on the side of the road. So it wasn't like crossing a little path, to get to the other side, or a modern paved street. It really wasn't like jaywalking at all. It was climbing down into a ravine, which is dangerous enough you might fall, and then trying to climb up on the other side of it, and anything could happen. Anything could happen. The Samaritan does so courageously, and he does 4 things. He stops the man's bleeding. He takes him to a safe place. He spends the night with him. He's present with him, and then he leaves money for his care. And this is why there are hospitals and many other charitable organizations around the world that have utilized the name Good Samaritan in their official titles. So why did the Samaritan cross the road? My first thought was, to avoid the priest and the Levite. But this is really a question about motivation. Why did he do it? What motivated him to do that? And the only answer is the Samaritan was motivated by compassion. Compassion was his motivation. The priest and the Levite, sadly, were not motivated by compassion. They were motivated by self-preservation. They understandably did not want to risk getting robbed and beaten themselves. And also, according to their laws, they were not allowed to touch people that had blood on them, and they certainly were not allowed to touch a corpse in case that man was dead. How could they tell? But they didn't know, but regardless, they were not allowed to touch that person. Both of which, if they did that, they would be ritually unclean. And the last thing a priest or a Levite wants to do is become ritually unclean, because then they'd have to miss work for a few days. A Levite, by the way, was a priest that was primarily, his job was to work in the temple in Jerusalem. That's what his inheritance allowed him to do. He had the cushy job. He wasn't about to give that up. Now, you might think the Samaritan didn't need to worry about such things like getting robbed or becoming ritually unclean, but to the contrary, a Samaritan outside of his region would be in even more danger, first of all, of physical harm. He would be in even more danger of being beat up and left to die by someone. So to be brutally honest, let me give you a couple of modern parallel examples to get into the mind of the Samaritan, what he must have been thinking. I know it's a parable, but if this was real life, think of a white person who is afraid to drive through a predominantly African American neighborhood. Think of a black person who fears seeing the lights of a police car in their rearview mirror. That's what it was like for the Samaritan to be traveling between Jericho and Jerusalem. There would have been a lot of fear. Now also remember that the Samaritans saw themselves as religious purists. They are the guardians of the law, right? They are religious purists, and so they would be even more concerned about touching blood or a corpse. They would be even more concerned. And yet, according to this oxymoronic story, the Samaritan, with so much at stake, is the one who crosses the road or the ravine to get to the half-dead man. The question is then why? Why would such a purist of the law be the one that sidesteps the law in order to practice compassion? My answer is, perhaps because he was a purist, he knew the essence of the law better than the Jewish priest or the Levite. He knew that obeying the law should never get in the way of showing compassion. Obeying the law should never get in the way of showing compassion. To paraphrase the voice of God we heard from our first reading in Deuteronomy 30, you don't have to travel into space in order to practice the law of compassion, nor do you need to cross an ocean. It's not that hard. All you need to do is cross the road. Why did the Samaritan cross the road? Because someone needed him to. So what roads are we being called to cross? Amen.